In this Redshift tutorial, we are going to cover AOVs. In this tutorial, we are going to cover how to set up some simple AOVs to rebuild our beauty, how to composite our AOVs back together from different AOVs, as well as how to use simple puzzle mats to grade individual elements in our scene. So in this scene, in this nuke tree, as you can see, I have a multi-layer DXR, and you can tell it's a multi-layer DXR by using a layer contact sheet, and it will show you all the separate AOVs that are stored in this multi-layer DXR. To render a multi-layer DXR, all you need to do in Maya is to make sure that you have force, combined beauty and AOVs into a single file checked on, and it will give you a multi-layer DXR instead of having all the AOVs as separate files. Now, the main benefits of using AOVs is to help us composite our final image together, and it allows us the freedom to tweak individual elements instead of having to re-render images every time we wanted to make a simple change. For example, we can ignore this section for now and only focus on the green area here. To rebuild your beauty, all you need is your diffuse lighting, your GI if your GI is enabled, subsurface scattering if you have some subsurface scattering in your scene, caustics if you have caustics, reflections, refractions if there are refractive elements, specular lighting, and emission if you have emission. In this case, we only have a very small emission which is coming from our HDRI in the background. If you have emissive materials such as emissive shaders, they will show up in this AOV. As you can see, we also have a puzzle mat which stores a puzzle mat in the red, green and blue channels that allows us to grade individual elements in the scene. To rebuild a beauty from the multi-layer DXR, all you need to do is use a shuffle node and shuffle out the diffuse lighting from all the AOVs that are stored. As you can see, I already shuffled out all the AOVs that we need to rebuild our beauty. Once you shuffled everything out, you need to use a merge node to plus them all back together. So as you can see, the diffuse lighting is being plussed back with a GI, subsurface scattering, caustics, reflections, refractions, specular lighting, and finally emission to create our final beauty image. As you can see, if I compare our composited image versus the beauty render, and I switch between them with 1 and 2, they'll be extremely similar. There is a very small discrepancy in the render as we have some very bright lights in our scene. In the Redshift settings, when you go to output and you have max subsample intensity set to 2, bear in mind that this will clamp your beauty render, but it will not clamp your AOVs. For example, if you have a look at the bright specular values in the beauty layer, which is the sun right here, we can see that the value is at 4.74, and in the specular lighting AOV that we shuffle out, if you notice, the value goes high as 61. To combat this, there are multiple things that you can do. For example, in Maya, you can turn up your max subsample intensity, which will mean that your beauty is not going to be clamped, or you can clamp the AOV by checking enable clamping color and AO channels and set the max value to be similar to your max subsample intensity. Now that we composited our image back together, let's see how we can use some of these AOVs to grade different parts of the image. For example, now that everything is shuffled out and merged back together, we can use a simple grade node on the caustics to bring up the values. If I just look at the end of my node tree, use a grade node, and as you can see, if I toggle it on and off, you can see how I can bring up the values just for the caustics. You can simply slide the gain up and down to bring it darker or brighter. Same with the reflections. If I wanted to make the reflections brighter, I can just simply use a grade node before I merge everything back together and just use the gain slider to bring the reflections up or down. As you can see, this is extremely powerful as it allows you to tweak individual parts of the image instead of having to re-render. We can also use the puzzle mat to tweak individual elements in the scene. For example, we see this blue sphere. If I wanted to make this a bit brighter, I can just use a grade node after I merge everything back together, if I just look through that, I can shuffle out the blue from this node by using a shuffle, shuffling everything out into the blue channel. As you can see, we'll get a mask for the blue, and we can use this for a grade. If I now wanted to make the blue sphere brighter, I can just bring up the gain. As you can see, it's extremely efficient to tweak individual elements in the scene. I can also use this as a hue shift to change the color of the element. Now that we covered AOVs, let's cover what's the difference between the pre-multiplied diffuse lighting, GI, SSS, and so on passes versus the diffuse lighting raw and diffuse filter passes. If you have a look in Maya, in the AOV section, when you want to create your AOVs to rebuild your beauty, you'll notice that you have a diffuse filter, diffuse lighting raw, and diffuse lighting. At first it might be extremely confusing to figure out what passes you exactly need, but after this tutorial hopefully it will be a lot clearer. If you go back into Nuke, the main passes that you need with the least amount of AOVs to rebuild your beauty is diffuse lighting, GI, SSS, and so on. However, if you require more control in these AOVs, you can go down the diffuse lighting raw and filter method. Basically, rendering diffuse lighting raw, GI raw, SSS raw, and so on just gives you an extra step of control that you might require if your scene is extremely complex. As you can see in this top part of the node tree, I'm shuffling out the diffuse lighting raw and the diffuse filter, and these two get multiplied back together to actually create the diffuse lighting pass. So if you compare the multiplied together AOVs versus the diffuse lighting AOV, and in this case I just rendered all of these AOVs just for the presentation, but obviously for your final render you would only render either diffuse lighting raw and the filter, or this. So as you can see, the multiplied result and the diffuse lighting AOV are exactly the same. So if I press 1 here, 2 here, and we compare, you can see that the multiplied result is exactly the same as this AOV. So basically the diffuse lighting, GI, and so on, all these passes are just the raw multiplied by its corresponding filter. For example, in diffuse lighting raw, GI, SSS, and caustics, these all get multiplied together with the diffuse filter. You can check these are exactly the same. If I just press 1 and 2 over here and compare, these should create identical values. Okay. Now, in the case of reflections or refractions and so on, you might have its own color. Okay, so you have your reflections raw and you have a reflections filter that will come with it. Now sometimes it might be confusing as the reflections filter is actually called reflections tint. But when you add the AOV in Maya, so if we just find reflections, if you go down the raw method, you'll need your reflections filter and your refractions raw, or reflections raw, sorry. If you don't go down the raw method, because you don't need that extra control, you can just add your reflections AOV. Okay, so now that we covered the raw method versus rendering the pre-multiplied AOVs, let's go into our scene and set up these AOVs as well as the puzzle map. If anything gets a bit confusing or you want to do this from scratch, here's a little cheat sheet that should explain how to get the different AOVs or how to merge them versus multiply them together. The main thing that you need to keep in mind, or easy way of remembering, is if you go down the raw and the filter method, those need to be multiplied together. So as you can see, these are all multiplies, and once you multiply them together, you would just have to plus them together at the bottom. Okay, so for example, if I go down this method, obviously after all of these I would need a merge and plus, and just for the sake of it, let's just do it really quick. So if I use a plus node, if I find it, there we go, and I can grab all of these, and actually you can connect them to the same node. So if you're in a rush, you can connect all of these to the same plus node. The only reason why I've done it nice and neatly here is that it's easier to demonstrate once we click through one by one. So if you look at this result, And obviously we will need the spec lighting as well as the emission. Okay, so this result will be exactly the same as this result. Okay, just to demonstrate that both methods work exactly the same way. The only difference is that these are pre-multiplied and these are not pre-multiplied, which gives you an extra level of control. Okay, so once we're in Maya, if you go to the AOV tab, you'll notice that at the top we'll have a mode to either enable or disable all the AOVs. This is extremely useful if you have different render layers, and on some of them you might not want to render any AOVs at all. You can just do a global override and disable it instead of doing an override one by one to stop rendering it. So the AOVs that we're going to use are the pre-multiplied AOVs instead of using the raw and filter method for the least amount of AOVs. Let's select all the AOVs that we need to rebuild our beauty. So as you can see, I already pre-selected these. We need caustics for our caustics, diffuse lighting, emission for the HDRI. We need the global illumination, reflections, refractions, specular lighting, and subsurface scatter. If you have all these selected and add them, you'll notice that they'll all appear at the bottom with a little checkbox next to it where you can disable or enable one by one. And you can also see that you can delete them by hitting the little bin, or go to its options by selecting this arrow. Now this options is extremely useful, for example, for things like the depth pass. You might want to render this one AOV in 32-bit. So in the options box, we can set this to be 32-bit just for that one AOV, so we have the extra precision that we need for data passes. If you don't need the AOV, we can simply delete them. Okay, so let's go ahead and set up our puzzle mat. So I'll just press P and add it. In our puzzle mat options box, as you can see by default, it sets to be a material ID, or you can also set an object ID. To set a material ID, you need to set the material ID on a shader group, or to set an object ID, you need to set that on the shape node, or you can create a Redshift node, a Redshift object ID node as well. So for example, if I wanted to use an object ID, I can select my sphere, go to the shape node. Under Redshift, we can set the object ID. Or if we want multiple objects to be the same and we don't want to do it one by one, you can create a Redshift object visibility by going to Redshift object properties and object ID node for selection. Once you have that, you have a little node here with all your objects in there, and you can set the object ID on this node. Once it's not required anymore, you can simply delete it. So let's go back to our puzzle mat and set up the material ID. I'm going to set these numbers to be 1, 2, 3, and in my red shader, by hitting this arrow, it will take me to the shader group, and as you can see, I can set this to be 1. The green one I can set to be 2, and the blue one I can set to be 3. Once we have these shader group material IDs set, they'll render perfectly fine as long as you make sure that this is set on material ID and you have 1, 2, 3 in this options box. You can also tick reflect, refract IDs, as these are refractive and reflective. You'll see some of their IDs come across on these bricks and so on. The next thing that we need to set up is to make sure that it's a multi-layer DXR. So in the common tab, make sure you have force combined beauty and AOVs into single file checked on. This way, when you finish rendering, it will be a single file that you can shuffle out all your AOVs instead of loads of separate files. Now that all the AOVs are set up and ready to render, once the image finished rendering, we will be able to shuffle out all the AOVs, and using them we'll be able to plus them all back together to rebuild the beauty. Thanks for watching the Intro to AOV tutorial. I'll see you in the next part.